Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of day 1 of the Case for Quality Collaborative Community Forum. I'm very excited to be joined by our esteemed panel. This session will explore the impact the use of virtual technology has had on how we prepare and manage activities associated with appraisals, audits, remediation, and quality system compliance during this pandemic. Remember, we will be hosting a live Q&A at the end of this pre-recorded session. Our panel moderator is Kareem El-Wakil from PwC. Joining Kareem is our panel of experts. I will give it over to Kareem and he will introduce our panel and kick off this session. Welcome, Kareem.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Joe. And obviously today we've got a really esteemed panel to talk about this specific topic. So maybe starting with George Zach, obviously from Two Harbors Consulting. Alongside George, we've also got Rob Becker from Edwards Life Sciences, Ravi Nabar from Illumina, Francisco Vicente from the US FDA, and James Pink from NSF. So thank you guys for joining our panel today, and really looking forward to a healthy and engaging, interesting dialogue for our participants here today. So maybe starting from the top, why don't we get into adjusting to a virtual world? So specifically, you know, this pandemic has really pushed the limits of what audit and appraisals look like, you know, now with this kind of virtual environment that we're dealing with. There had to be significant adjustments, and you guys clearly here are representing a pretty broad spectrum, both in terms of, you know, corporations, auditors, auditees. So I'd really like to get your perspectives on kind of what are the most significant adjustments that you've had to make in the past year, you know, given the challenges of operating in this virtual world from an audit perspective. So maybe starting with the top, James, what's your perspective on that?
Oh, I've got quite a few, really. I think the first was obviously the technological challenges at first, really, to adapt to, certainly as an individual who is much more akin to walking around a production facility and then going into an office and actually interacting with people and paper, you know, at the time of the assessment. To be able to replace that with more of a virtual environment was a challenge. I think the second thing for me was the loss of senses. You know, ultimately, if I go into an orthopedic manufacturing facility, I can smell the cutting oil. I can see the production facility. I can get a sense already of the main things or certain things that would either confirm around changes or help me understand if something is a little bit different. So those senses have certainly changed quite dramatically, and trying to replace them with something, you know, that can ultimately give us the assurance that the organization is still culturally okay. It's still, you know, doing the right things has been a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. And if I want to take that maybe from your perspective, Cisco, more on the regulatory side, what are you seeing? What's the biggest change that you've had to deal with from the FDA side?
So I think there's quite a few things. First, in terms of how we as FDA adjust to things, you know, a lot of what we deal with and we engage with is built into regs. So the first one was just hitting the wall of, you know, by law, we can't really consider this like a typical inspection or traditional inspection, right? Because we can't do that way. So trying to even just reframe that was something that was interesting, and where I think we saw a lot of potential advantage with the idea of the audit model. You know, the other piece of this was something in terms of just learning as we even tried to proceed with some of our virtual assessments in the appraisal mode, was getting everybody past the mindset, including us internally, right, that you have to be on site to really get an idea and perspective of what's going on, right, to really get an understanding and be able to drive and deliver value. But I think something that is more fundamental as we've been learning that'll probably come into discussions later, it's how do we really rethink the idea of what we're trying to get out of an appraisal moving forward, right? So that as we keep moving in the virtual world, or we try to enable more of this, we're actually maximizing that experience in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. And maybe if I flip it around, so Ravi, from your perspective, so you're on the corporate side of things, so having to deal with auditors coming in, walking through the doors, and also managing an internal audit program within your own four walls. Can you talk a little bit about the adjustments and changes that you've had to make on your end to be able to deal with some of the things that James and Cisco just walked through?
Yeah, certainly, Kareem, thanks. I think the first thing we ran into was a big oh gosh factor, because it impacted everything from the way of working to the scheduling to figuring out how were we going to set up, how were we going to staff this thing, what impact would it have on the schedules, how would we essentially still meet all the requirements of ISO 19011, but not have hands and eyes and ears to the ground physically live. Just coming to grips with that, I think, was quite a challenge. But once we came to the understanding that this was something that could probably have some benefits as well, we quickly wrote a white paper on how to go about this, and had inputs from the global audit team to identify best practices, and then did a few internal audits that way, and then got into external audits, both with notified bodies as well as with customers. So I think it took a little while to refine that, but once it started kind of clicking, I think we came to the understanding that there's some efficiencies that can be gained out of this. But there's also some losses, such as the real tactile feel of the warehousing system, some of our distributors, the way that they store our products, some of the physical live warm body interactions that give us a good sense for kind of the veracity of some of the things that takes longer to establish sometimes virtually. But it did result in some best practices and in some key behaviors and some key competencies needing to be developed on the part of our teams that were hosting audits.
Yeah,
and there were, a few glitches here and there, but I think it brought to life the importance of things like paying attention to pre-recorded tours, to having good technology available to make things clearly visible to the auditor virtually, and also the incredible need to just set up everything virtually in advance to be effective.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And you started to go where I was going next, which is I heard a little bit from yourself and others here on the panel that around, potential best practices you start to recognize and realize as you went through this transition. I want to probe a little bit more on that and continue kind of where you were going, Ravi. So George, can you comment a little bit on some of the key best practices that you've observed emerging as a byproduct, if you will, of, the pivot towards a more virtual environment, virtual world in this audit appraisal space?
Yeah, absolutely. So as James initially mentioned, the technology concern or risk is something that we've looked to address. So prior to performing an appraisal or an audit, a good practice is to do a technology check. Hey, even before this panel, we did a technology check, right? Let's make sure everybody has good sound, that they have video, that they have a backup. Not everybody's going to be in the facility anymore, right? They may be working from home, and their wireless may not necessarily be as effective as a corporate wireless that they have. So you have to check those things. Doing that before you get to the quote unquote on-site phase is a planning and a risk mitigation piece that you address. Making sure just with that technology check, because Some people use Teams, some people use Zoom, some people use GoToMeeting, some people can't use those particular things. All of those things, you have to check out that those tools are compatible. So just the technology piece, well, and even though, you know, we were all riding a bike 14 months ago, and then we were suddenly all asked to ride a unicycle, as we've gotten through this, people have gotten better at this from a competency perspective with the technology. You still want to, ahead of time, address that technology risk. I think another one is, just to throw another one out there, is yes, this being on camera like this all day has a fatigue factor to it. Looking at yourself in the mirror all day, even if it can be very tiring. And recognizing that people are often now going back to back to back to back, and they don't necessarily have the break between the meetings that they previously had. And recognizing that and finding ways to, with whatever organization that you're working with, auditing or appraising, finding ways to break it up. You don't necessarily have to run that session for 3 hours continuously. Finding ways to build a rapport with the organization should be part of your planning and your risk mitigation. So those are, I don't think that's particularly different than doing something on site. It's a different challenge in doing it virtually and finding the way to build those connections with the site from a risk perspective. But really, it all comes down to, just like any other project that you run, it comes down to planning and identifying those risks, be it technology risks, time zone risks, building a rapport with the site type risk, and working through those and just landing on what each of those particular mitigations are.
Yeah, thanks for that, George. And maybe if I turn to you, Rob, to build on that. So we heard some of the challenges or risks, that the panel has been feeling are, number one, the lack of tactility, if you will, in terms of being able to really feel and understand the audit subject matter, if you will, up close and impersonal. And then maybe the second around the technology. Are there others, other risks and challenges that you've had to deal with as you've pivoted to this kind of virtual world?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger things, and this may be a long-term positive, is we actually had a lot more engagement with our auditors, prior to the event. And that's not typical for how these types of activities would be conducted. And so to make sure that we had a successful event for both parties in a limited amount of time, there was a lot more dialogue up front on planning, specific areas. What do you want to see? How do you want to break up document review versus production tours? What kind of presentation are you okay with? And so I think that exchange up front and some of that pre-planning actually helped us have a more successful event, because we could think through and we were more clear on, okay, we're going to go down this line, we're going to show this, this is how we're going to present it. And we could have a lot of that lined up, and that actually helped us schedule our internal resources better. So the actual event itself was more efficient from a resource standpoint internally, because we kind of already had it set up on, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. A lot of that was pre-planned and taken care of ahead of time. So there were some positives that came out of it. It felt like we were less rushed and less, ad hoc requests and responding than a normal audit. We had a lot of material already planned. It was more presenting it. And that actually led to a more even, sort of less stressful feel for the entire event. And I think the other thing in terms of planning, like George was talking about IT, is, doing a lot of connecting with your auditor. If you're going to share files, if you're sharing video, you might have multiple firewalls you're going through. I know for us, syncing files, like if we were sharing via SharePoint or something, making sure that the person on the other end, how fast did that refresh? Did video come through okay, or did we have to just stream that? And doing some dry runs, I thought was really important. With every new auditor, making sure that all those things work well and that we vetted those out before the event was important.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Rob. Building on that, so if I want to pivot more towards the technology side, so I think Ravi and others have alluded to this, but there's challenges, and George, challenges with technology and really finding the right balance. Can you, Ravi, talk a little bit about some of the things that you've done from a technology perspective that worked and some of the things that didn't necessarily work as you were making this change?
Yeah, thanks, Kareem. Yeah, absolutely. I think the technology piece is kind of critical to having an effective remote audit. We found this out after a few trial and error type of attempts. And I think it became clear that having good bandwidth is important. And having, as George mentioned before, compatibility is pretty important between the auditor's system and our system. Also, in larger audits where, there's, say, more than 20 or 25 people, it becomes pretty important to set the ground rules for who's going to be on video and when they're going to be on video, because that video does chew up a good amount of bandwidth. We also found that when we tried to do a live tour, just kind of off the bat, that by itself ran into sometimes timing issues, or sometimes into issues where the auditor had to stand behind a glass wall because of COVID restrictions, and the person on the other side of the wall was having difficulty with certain angles to be able to show the auditor the details of the operation, or answer questions specific to an operator. And so what we learned was that paying a lot of attention to having a nice video created up front ahead of time, showing the details of the manufacturing operation or the warehousing operation, so that the auditor could see that video and then go live through that same setup with a single experienced person. This was the other thing. We found it's better to have one person who knows pretty much the flow in a back and front to be the host for that live portion of the tour. And then the technology that went with that, it seemed to go well if we could do a good job with an iPhone or an iPad. And I know that in one case they tried using a GoPro, and that actually worked pretty well. Now, I've used a GoPro just on vacations before, but I've never thought about using it for this type of thing. But it actually it does work if it's tried and tested. So those were some things that were kind of important. The other was to set a certain amount of training and to the SMEs and to the people that were going to be participating in the audit, and to set expectations on when to join the audit. In other words, it's not a spectator sport. So if you're not called by the audit team, don't just sit and spectate because you're chewing up bandwidth. But certainly be aware of when you are muted or not muted. As George pointed out very early in this presentation, it's very important to know whether you're being recorded, whether you're muted or unmuted. And people those types of things, I think, don't come naturally to everyone at the same time. So that's a bit of a learning and a training effort involved. I think making sure that things that need to be made visible are visible is important. And from a technology perspective, I think we learned that when you have a chaperoned audit versus an unchaperoned, and that means you just give an auditor access to read certain things like the quality policy, the quality manual, certain level 2 procedures, certain non-product specific level 3 procedures. It was important to us to set up the box site in such a way that those documents couldn't necessarily be downloaded by the auditor. On the other hand, we found that just letting them have access to that without being chaperoned could raise certain questions. But we thought that there was a fine line there, and certain documents, for stage 1 type audits, could be certainly reviewed by the auditors on their own. But then there were certain details around product specific procedures and certain things that were more interactive that lent themselves better to chaperoned audits. In other words, having somebody that was a subject matter expert lead the auditor through the document to better understand it. There was also the aspect of kind of going directly into the system, and how effective is that, and how much more efficient is it when you can let an auditor kind of write alongside a particular application that's resident within the auditee's infrastructure, and actually look at records together, so that it then eliminated the inefficiency of having to create records of those records and then put them up on a box site, for example. So we learned that having live access to certain systems, as long as they were properly explained by SMEs involved, was actually more effective and more efficient than trying to create records of those records, because it's really a collaborative exercise, and we just want to get through it together as quickly as we can, so the auditors get their information and we can actually help meet those obligations.
Very good. Thanks, Ravi. So we heard a little bit about the use of GoPros, better approaches to file and record sharing. What about some more advanced technologies, maybe coming to you, James, but things like AR, the headsets, some of the more advanced technologies? What's your take on that? Have you seen those used successfully in these sorts of environments? Are they not ready, not yet ready for prime time? What's your view on kind of the more advanced stuff?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think if we go to look at the augmented approach, back to what Ravi was explaining, his bandwidth is absolutely critical. So where you've got an organization that has a very state-of-the-art building in terms of the radio communications, RF, and all of the sort of the Wi-Fi and all whatever is in there, there was experience of some successful augmented, with the various augmented lenses and other bits and pieces, where you get to feel, and you can move to the right, you can move to the left, and so on and so forth. You can hone in, you can look up, all those type of things. And I think that augmented was great in my experience when the facility was designed in a state-of-the-art manner. The Wi-Fi of the auditors was at the right level, and of course, the building was designed. But we're going into companies where they've grown and grown and grown and grown, and there's a big concrete wall on this part of the plant deliberately. The foundations and the ceiling and the walls have been built so that maybe the infrastructure is there to maintain product conformity, or it might be a contamination control strategies or something. And what you find is that the area where of most interest you've got an operational facilities is where the augmented feel is not so great. Some of the other, as said, in principle, it was fine. But then you also got that very haptic, tactile feedback as well, which the wearer had to be professionally trained to be able to think about the person on the other end. And instead, you would just feel, I suffered motion sickness, strangely enough, because we were trying to concentrate, and then meanwhile the wearer would be distracted, and you'd be forever, the movement is pretty off-putting. So it was sort of like, well, yeah, I guess in various situations where 3 or 4 things are all in place, such as the Wi-Fi, such as a very well-trained user and wearer, a well-trained auditor who can sort of use certain commands and prompts to almost reenact that where they want to go. It worked. Did it work well? In some instances. Is it a work in progress? Of course. Let's not, these are great tools that back to Ravi's point about professional videos of the manufacturing process. If they're taken from the eye of the operator or the auditor, and you can see that walkthrough, that's where the augmented technologies really do come into play. Just one other thing as well is that having access into live systems, I had a fascinating audit of a distribution warehouse that was fully automated, and therefore there were already camera systems set up for that fully automation. No human was allowed to be within the racking and the stackings and all of that. And that was a fascinating audit, because you could actually, they had done a user design for people who needed to be able to get into the system and see palletized products, to be able to hone in on the serial numbers of certain things, so that the quality was really, really good. So having certain state-of-the-art facilities, you know, there was other ways of being able to, you know, get that feel and retrieve that sense that we've all lost.
That's actually a great point, and maybe a natural segue to this next, kind of question or topic I want to push on, which is, it seems like, to your point, James, the situation or the shortcomings, let's say the shortcomings exposed by the virtual environment for many organizations has led them to rethink their status from a digital perspective. Are we transforming digitally quickly enough? So you gave a great example of a company that went ahead and fully automated, digitized their warehousing, and as a result, they were able to support a far more state-of-the-art approach to audits as a result of that. Just to talk a little bit about that, have you seen, and maybe I'll push on you, George, here, have you seen that companies have really chosen to accelerate their digital transformations, for example, specifically in the quality domain, in order to enable this sorts of stuff going forward? In other words, if we become more of a digitized organization and our quality data is there and we're using sensors throughout our manufacturing floor and cameras, et cetera, a more digital footprint with respect to quality, it enables things like more advanced state-of-the-art type auditing techniques as well. Are you seeing some of that?
Yeah, I don't think the business case is directly to your point. It's not to make audits easier,
Mm-hmm.
but if that's part of the business case, if you're developing AR or VR for the purposes of training staff, that might be very helpful to bolster your audit program in this fashion as well. Worked with an organization that was making a very large capital investment in essentially taking iPad-like devices, putting them on something similar to a Segway. So in their facility in the Pacific Rim, you could then, as an engineer back in the US, drive that around on the manufacturing floor and get to different places to see how manufacturing operations were occurring. Their goal is to have 3 or 4 of those walking through the facility. Now that allows for that's a huge capital investment, obviously, but that allows for your engineering, your R&D folks in North America be able to work more directly with your manufacturing folks in the Pacific Rim. They're not doing that for the purposes of we're not investing in this because we want to make our audits easier. They're investing in that
Right.
so that they have a better communication between engineering and manufacturing. Oh, gee whiz, it's going to help us now when we have to do an audit because we can also use that same sort of technology. So I think the answer is yes, if the business case can be made and if the organization has the capital to make those sorts of investment. Certainly, as we know, in the medical device space, many organizations are very small, and so they're not quite ready to make that sort of leap. At the same time, a lot of these technology solutions, they're all in our hands, and they're finding creative ways to get there as well.
Yeah, and that's a nice lead into kind of a pivot that I want to make specifically around learnings from other industries. So maybe to throw this in your direction, Cisco, is we've seen other industries like finance, for example, the banking industry, where they've really done a good job digitizing their entire value chain. All of their data is there, right? They're able to drive more data-driven, continuous audit approaches, right? Where an audit is not an event, but something that's happening continuously over time. Do you see an opportunity, you as being on the regulatory side, do you see an opportunity for the med device industry to chart a similar path? And if so, what are some of the barriers, or inhibitors to potentially getting there?
So I actually, not only do I see it, I think it's part of what we're trying to drive towards, right? It's really something we've been collectively and, just putting into our forward-thinking view of how we've engaged, even in case for quality or some of the programs even CDRH has been driving with our pre-cert vision for that. The idea that there is a way that we can get to that mode so that we can maintain that oversight. It's easier, it's faster, it's more real time. There's no reason why it can't be done in the medical device space. Now, barriers. I already talked about one about regulatory authority. What's the legal barrier that needs to change? That's something that needs to happen. The other piece of that is the technology, right? Not just on our side, but within the industry partners, and what are they enabling? How do they have that capability there? As George just alluded to, right? The ideal situation is they're doing it for the right reasons for their business. We just tap into that afterwards as an auditor or as a regulator moving in. And I think the other piece of that is something that we've all been working to, is really reshifting the mindset on what are the right things to be looking at and measuring, right? Because if you're talking about that continuous audit mode, you're not looking at data, metrics that are coming out there. You're not looking at the physical output or an artifact like a document or a PDF. What are the right things to be looking at? What are the right things for the companies, right? They vary in size, they vary in product, they vary in capability. What are those things that matter, and how do we build a system that is flexible enough to accommodate that?
Yeah, that's great. And maybe, Rob, if I shift over to you, having heard what you just heard from Cisco, from the FDA side, what's your perspective on the industry side? What do you need to do to be able to enable that sort of future going forward? What investments do you have to make within your own organizations to be able to start to drive in that direction? Because as Cisco mentioned, part of the challenge is, of course, regulatory, but also it's the level of maturity within the med device industry. It's not at the level of, let's say, finance or banking or whatever it may be. So what's your perspective on that? Yeah,
Kareem, it's interesting you use the word maturity. One of the things, we're talking about this as part of the case for quality. And I'd say we've had multiple sites go through the appraisal process, and really a lot of the feedback and where the appraisal process points us is to digitization. And so where we look at pain points in the organization, where we look at where the organization could be performing better, it's the right information available in a way that makes sense to them, the ability for them to make decisions on that, and taking out all the transactional work that is not value added. If you could barcode something versus keystrokes and writing something down on paper and scanning it and transcribing it, it's unbelievably enabling for the organization if you can go through those layers. And I think a lot of it is capital resources, companies with different sizes, different constraints, those are all realities. And I think you just have to take a look at where and what can you take advantage of, and think of it as a long-term effort. And how do you start with a base? How do you cascade that to more capability over time? And how do you look at, and again, the appraisal process that we go through with MDDAP is great because it points out where our bigger weaknesses are, and so do you need to look at project management, software, and systems? Is that maybe the biggest opportunity? Or is your quality system completely on paper and it's really difficult for anyone to manage? And I think it's a matter of setting priorities, like any sort of business planning, and understanding resources you have, and recognizing that, I think for any viable entity, you've got to be thinking 4 or 5 years down the road, and just incrementally building that roadmap so that you can be moving in that direction constantly.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to come back to another topic and maybe pivoting away from the technology for a bit here, but coming back to the resourcing and the capabilities, because many of you over the last 30 minutes have brought this up, right? The reality is shifted on the ground, maybe new capabilities required. I want to probe a little bit on that and ask maybe James if you could get us started here. How has yeah, go ahead.
No, go on, Kareem.
No, I was just going to ask, how is from a staffing team makeup perspective, how have you pivoted your thinking in this virtual environment, James?
Yeah, I mean, it really is interesting when Rob speaks, about enabling, the technology, enabling the digitalization, and when Cisco says about moving into more predictive or continuous sort of measures, it's been very interesting, because the way in notified bodies of audit traditionally is to assign a level of competence to a particular task. So whether it's a quality system auditor who has got the background knowledge of the design or the technology or the manufacturing processes, or whether it's a technical expert that has got a more fundamental understanding of the product itself and the risks and the verification and validation activities that need to come with it. What we've seen is that very often our experts, whom are, if for instance, if we're looking at seeing data on a second load sterilization cycle, you've done another load again, you've recycled that. The auditor would be faced with lots and lots of decisions, and almost unilaterally operating around their judgment. Whereas in this new world of virtual technology, you can literally just call up a microbiologist and be into they can travel thousands of miles across from where they've just been and be at the next audit in Peru or in India or in the UK. So it's absolutely fascinating, the opportunities that you have, where these resources are very finite. To get somebody who has biocompatibility expertise and a particular sterilization methodology and its its residuals, for example, is pretty much a one in, I'm going to let Cisco do that ratio. But ultimately we are sharing really finite resources. But with the virtual world, we've got this opportunity to not just be in speed dial and a text message, but plan to be available for all these different types of audits. And that in itself has been a real benefit. Some of the assessments that I've participated in and being able to call up a software expert because I unexpectedly came across a particular concern over an automated manufacturing process, for example. I would have to have worked my way through that and been very cognizant of my own expertise and my own capabilities, which of course is not in the automation of that manufacturing kit. Whereas now I can literally send a WhatsApp message and say, hey, have you got 5 minutes? And literally you're scheduled in and you're there, and ultimately that is adding to the quality, which again changes the data points. It stops you just from looking at a batch record and saying, oh yeah, that's that the DMR is in accordance with the DHR, etc., etc. They're now able to move that into what I would say risk-based auditing, but then with the expert at your side, which is it's been a big sort of eye opener for me.
If I can ask,
can I ask James a question?
Please.
Because I think that's great that you have this bullpen of technical people that you can go to on the drop of a dime, if the young people remember what that would mean. But I think I'm also seeing that audits often create a challenged conversation in the first place, right? And good auditors are looking to overcome that. And I think there's another challenge in doing it through technology. And so when I think of skill sets that are required, the ability to navigate the soft skills to navigate those conversations, I think are more important than they're always important. Don't get me wrong, but it seems like it's even maybe not more important. It's just a different set of skills, almost through the medium of a virtual call. Are you finding that some are more successful in this setting, or in others, because it's through all these little boxes, it's more challenged?
Oh, absolutely. And now we're being recorded. I don't want to offend everybody, but we basically, I've seen very traditional pharmaceutical audits where these people are wandering down the floors and saying, that's got a crack in the ceiling, that's not being painted. As I call it, forgive me, gunslingers, ultimately, who are able to very, very quickly sort of to raise the temperature in the audit, to challenge, now you can literally be digitally cut off if you haven't got those skill sets, Judge. Absolutely, you know, and that it's back to what Ravi was saying about having this one-to-one relationship where the auditor is engaging with not just the auditee but the guide, and they are all enabling the audit through, as you say, more heuristic questioning. You know, not jumping onto a particular point of evidence in a document, because of course your focal view is narrowed so much with the way that you are reviewing information and documentation into better, more heuristic ways of questioning that don't seem forensic, but they are. You know, absolutely, George, absolutely. And then being able to then navigate the expertise to augment your decision making is something that I've found to be really helpful. So back to your point again around, I mean, I was on the ventilator challenge in the UK where we were scaling up a lot of different technologies and we were remote, but because a team was assigned, we were able to use different people to go through the questioning. And then of course, almost act as an interpreter to the audit and say, right, these guys have got this type of material. We're a little bit worried about that. What do you think? You'd get the answer, but it was filtered. So the expert isn't necessarily engaged in the actual assessment. It's still the auditor on a one-to-one basis. Sorry, I'm going on now, but it's definitely something I picked up as well, George.
Thanks.
I actually, just a quick follow-up on that. You could make the case that the technology, so the flexible kind of expert, flexible expert model that you were talking about, James, you could make the case the technology to do that was available for years now. So to some degree, the pandemic and the situation, the challenge that we're dealing with today kind of opened up our minds to enable us to kind of move in that direction. What steps do we have to take to make sure that our minds don't close back up? Right. And then we don't go back to the approach that we had before. What's your view on that?
Well, we were all busy doing other things. You know, the way that the way that the planning processes in both notified bodies, in FDA, and any regulator is, we all work on jobs. You know, we don't just turn up on a Monday morning and say, right, open. Monday through Friday, completely open. That's it. We have jobs. We have a workflow. We have allocated things, you know, responsibilities. And that way of work was the way of planning work, the way of conducting work was driven on a on-site, you know, now you've got your audit reports and your case files and everything. And then that goes through to a review process that might require national experts, or it might require specific experts involved. And it's very mechanistic, but it's mechanistic to the environment that we were operating within. That environment is completely upside down, you know. So it gives us those opportunities to rethink the way that we plan conformity assessment. Obviously, it's back to what Cisco is saying, is unfortunately the regs are a little bit, they're written in the same environment as well. So at some point we're going to have to sort of acknowledge that the regulations are going to have to be a little bit more, I don't know whether it's flexible or if it's just acknowledging that these activities happen in this way. Does that make sense, Karim? Sorry, I might have just...
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe you mentioned Cisco. I want to get your take on that as well from the regulatory side. What's your how do we make sure that we don't go back to where we were before? Because it sounds like we've learned quite a bit and we've, you know, leveraged the pandemic in the best way possible to try and drive a better process here. What's your perspective on how we make kind of backslide to old ways of doing things?
That's the watch out, right? We've got to collectively make a very deliberate effort to maintain some of this moving forward, reassess. I know internally we are, really trying to collect a lot of what we learned within the pandemic and really proactively figure out what we keep. You know, how do we do it? Because some of it's going to take work. And then, what is actually going to go back to normal. But if it isn't something that we, I think, collectively say we're going to do moving forward, especially as we get out of the pandemic and there's a lot that needs to be caught up on and everybody's got to kind of reset on things that have just moved in general since the pandemic started. it's going to be really easy to get back up to that whirlwind that I think James was alluding to beforehand, that we all get stuck in and aren't able to break out of, right, to proactively move some of this forward. So it is really going to take, this type of discussion, this type of engagements, bringing stuff like this forward and doing some of that strategic work, even some of our case for quality planning or future activities, because it's going to be really, really hard to stay out of that whirlwind and not keep some of this momentum going.
Great. Yeah. And actually, I want to, on that note, on the back of that, I want to ask all the panel members here, maybe we'll do a go around. What do you think the future looks like? If you had to project a year from now, what do audits actually look like? Are you going back to pre-COVID, times? Is it somewhere in between? If so, what does it actually look like? Maybe starting with you, Ravi. What's your view on that?
Sure, Kareem, thanks. I don't think that we can afford to backslide to the old ways of working. I don't mean that everything's going to go digital all the time. So I'm thinking it's probably going to go hybrid. But a full slide back to the old ways is simply not going to be supportable just by way of efficiencies. People are going to not return to their desk spaces as they used to have them. And there is already a very large effort on the part of many companies, including mine, to redefine the footprint for office space. So a large proportion of the workforce will not necessarily return 100% of the time to the old work schedule from the office. They might be working from the home. And the second thing is there are certain types of things, depending on I kind of look at it as 3 axes, and I'll be quiet after this. One is the type of product. The other is the type of audit. And the third is the degree of automation. If it's software we are looking at, how much sense does it actually make to actually have an on-site audit, other than looking at the security of the server room and things like that, which physical security? But so type of product, degree of automation. As we are seeing more and more of a move towards robots and robotization, how to pronounce that, roboticization, but more robotics. A good video, a good explanation of the workflow with a motion picture, slow motion, or whatever the case may be with bots. How much more do you expect an on-site audit to produce as opposed to an understanding of the robotic factory? And then the third thing is the degree of systems integration. As we move towards more quality and less compliance, as long as the systems are highly integrated and they're producing real life dashboards, which is where we're going, whether I as an auditee, see the same data live from the factory as an auditor does, it's really not so critical to be on site. But what is critical is when we do appraisals, where there's less evidentiary and more ways of working and cultural issues, I don't see how we can do that digitally as effectively, especially for first-time audits and especially for global audits with cross-cultural nuances. That would absolutely necessitate an on-site visit just to understand how people think and how they work. So that's 2 cents.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're thinking default to digital unless you can't really do it, in which case then you start to go back to your on-site as opposed to the reverse. So maybe, Rob, I want to get your take on that same question as well. What do you think audits look like a year from now?
Yeah, I think what Ravi said is true. I think that a lot of what we've talked about, the world has learned to adapt. And really, if you're looking at a lot of what we do in audits, I think it's more efficient for both parties to have more scheduled time. It's remote. We make people available when we need to. It's more efficient for them. I think of a person sitting in a conference room here on site and 2 people watching them read. There's elements of an audit that just don't add value. So I think if we can shift that to digital, and if we can make that more effective, our teams have already learned how to be available and how to connect in when they need to. And a lot of that can be more successful, I think, for everybody's time and efficiency. And then I think there's elements that we've lost in terms of what James was talking about, in terms of the tactile, in terms of George, trying to do an appraisal, which is, there's elements of it you want to see some of that live and in person, but you can focus that and you can make that a much more efficient use of the time. And I think the balance between the two, certainly is going to be more effective, more efficient. And I agree with Ravi. I wouldn't expect us to go back to where, we've got 2 conference rooms, one for a front room, one for a back room, and those are booked all week, and there's just lots of people standing by. I think we can be a lot more effective and efficient than that. And I think the technology, for the most part, shows that can work. Takes a little more planning, but I would argue that it probably worked out equally as well and had more effective conversations.
No, great. George, what's your take on that?
Well, look, I don't want to be traveling 150 nights a year either, to all these locations. So I hope that we can execute more of these activities virtually. But I think we all know there are some things that we're way more effective at being virtual, but we've also come to conclude there's a lot of things that are not nearly effective. Any of us that have had children that have gone through high school recently, you probably would understand that it's not nearly as effective, right? And I think I heard somebody else say, you might meet your spouse online, but you're not going to marry them that way. There's at some point where you have to get on site and do certain things. That might be observing the manufacturing line at very close and seeing how things are actually done. It might be the soft skills of building a trust with a relationship so that you can really provide improvement opportunities back to the organization. So I've actually started to do a little bit of travel. We're in an interesting space right now where you're showing up on site and you're now in these plastic cubes. We should have all gotten to plexiglass, I guess, about 15 months ago if we had been smart business people. And it's gonna take us a bit to figure out, I think, exactly what those things are. I can't say there's a one stop that's a one button that's gonna work for everybody virtually. But I think it's exactly what Ravi and Rob mentioned. If I'm just going out to a site to sit in a conference room for 3 days to look at documentation, I really can do that from the comfort of my own home. But if there's things that we agree upon that need to be seen on site, we should be finding how to do that as well. Hopefully, one of these high-tech companies are going to soon invent the beam me up, Scotty technology, so I can just show up over there and be there for that 4 hours and then get back without the 17-hour flight in between.
All right. Assuming that technology doesn't exist within the next year, James, what's your view on the future of audit here, the horizon?
I think we're all creatures of the environment that we're within. So as auditors in particular, we've got to replicate as much around how the organization makes decisions, on what basis that takes those decisions, and how it does that. So, as Ravi says, it's going to be a bit of a hybrid model. Nobody knows what that hybrid looks like at the moment. Many people have opinions of it, but if you're a manufacturing manager, you don't need to be on in the plant anymore. You now need to have an ecosystem so you can still make very well-based, factual-based decisions. And when you take those decisions, you have to have an environment where that analysis and that understanding can be made, so that you can take the right actions. And I think the auditors have to follow that. And I really do appreciate what George is saying around the way that an auditor it can actually be almost like a scout, if you wish, on site, so that you can, number one, match their understanding of the technologies, so that you can see the technologies viva voce, if you want, but then it's more about the cultural assessment, and then maybe relax a bit, and then another part of a virtual digital world kicks in based upon what capabilities the manufacturer has, so everyone can take advantage and leverage from that. And the commercial element in me would think that one might be less costly as the other, and then everyone realizes what the net benefit is to that when weighed up against the public health, the product safety sort of impact that they can have.
Yeah, very good. And then last but not least, Cisco, what's your perspective on audit over the next year, a year from now, let's say?
So I like the optimism about how it's going to change in a year. But let's see. In terms of what we've seen and what we've got the opportunity and the potential here to do, and I think how things can evolve. You've heard it referenced multiple times. Everybody here on the panel has said it in some way, shape, or form. But what we really get a chance to do over the next year is kind of rethink what is the intent of what we are going on site for, right? Is it, when we did an audit beforehand, it's really about that demonstration of control, right? Because we had no other way to assure that that was going on and happening. Now what we're seeing is that there's lots of tools available out there that show us as organizations are maturing, building in that digital capability, the system integration. Controls there. Not only is it there, but it is kind of error-proof, right? Do we need to be really focused on that portion anymore? And what we have is an opportunity to kind of come up with a model that is taking advantage of that control, incentivizing that control, driving that control. And to the point I think that George and James have made, we can turn the focus of an audit back to, okay, what is the human interaction, that dynamic piece, right? And we've seen this with even in the appraisal, right? The sites that are doing multi-sites, where is it that they want to have that assessment done and things break down? It's in that interaction, it's that communication, it's that culture weaving. And that is I think a lot more proactive, more engaged focus, because that's really where things always break down. It's the people. It's how things get shuffled and moved around. How do we turn our attention better to that area, which is always going to need some kind of human interaction, but we make that, something that is focused, value added, and not necessarily about rechecking everything that's already in established control. Now, it's not going to happen in a year, but I think in a year we can rethink what we really are looking to intend with some of the audits and the activities that we do right now.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Cisco, Rob, George, James, and Ravi. That was a really fascinating discussion, and hopefully the first of many on this topic. Obviously, there's a lot of dialogue still yet to happen around audits in the future going forward. So thank you all so much for that. All right, back to you, Joe. All right, everyone. So I think we actually have a few questions from the audience before we hand it back to Joe. So starting from the top, a question for either Ravi or Rob. Have you had, we've got a question here around FDA remote regulatory assessments. Have either of you, being in industry, having that industry perspective, have either of you undergone one of those remote regulatory assessments? And if so, what was the experience like?
Sure, I can. We haven't been through any FDA remote regulatory assessments as of yet. We have gone through remote audits from our notified body, BSI, and also been through the VIP remote appraisals, but none from a US FDA perspective yet. Rob?
Yeah, I would say the same experience for us. We've seen it from those other sources, but nothing that's a direct interaction with FDA.
Okay, thank you for that, guys. And then maybe another question here around, so we talked in the panel discussion, we talked about what does audit look like a year from now? Well, let's talk a little short term. So specifically, the question here is around, now that folks are getting vaccinated, what does the next few months look like in terms of ramping back up for cause or directed audits, inspections? And anyone have a perspective on that? Maybe George, do you have a viewpoint?
Sure. I was just recently asked to come on site by the facility. So I think there's a couple things that come into play there. There's a comfort level by the organization, what their policies are going to be. In some cases, they may, even though individuals might be comfortable, the organization may not be ready to open their doors to outside bodies. That may less and less, of course, they may be dealing with some sort of jurisdiction elements. That's probably a little different here in the US, but as soon as you start crossing into international borders, there's going to be some sort of consideration there as well as to how that opens up. Of course, it also is dependent upon the comfort of the auditor. It was really interesting in this one that I went to on site. They asked us to come on site, and then they put us into the typical kind of front conference room, and we had the plexiglass all set up around us. And then many of the folks still participated virtually from their offices in the facility, which I found kind of interesting. It still gave us the opportunity to be on site on the floor in the manufacturing area, but it was just different, right? So I think as we come out of the throes of COVID, and hopefully we don't go back into that, we're going to see some of this back and forth as to the comfort of the individuals involved, and the comfort of the organization as to what their policies are going to be.
Great. And James, what about from the EU side? Anything to add there?
I think there's a globalization nature now of supply chains in medical technologies, and I think that we're going to be, you only have to look at India at this very moment in time. We've got the new European regulation coming into force on the 26th of May this year. There's only, the European Commission has issued some guidance prior to the EU MDR about, what can and cannot be done remotely at this moment in time in terms of renewals, particularly for the medical device directives and some of the quality system assessment work. But I think that the global nature of the pandemic will really have a major impact, because, we might be able to visit the domestic manufacturer, those in the US, those in Europe. We might be able to get in and around those with auditors that are actually based in that area. But as soon as we move one layer down into the supply chain, I think it can create quite a lot of complexity at this moment in time. And without having that flexibility of remote auditing, back to what George was saying with, pretty much it's a similar feel, because everybody's really worried in the pandemic, and there's still, variants we're even more worried about at the moment. So I can't see within the next year or so much changing, other than in some areas, particularly where, it's a high risk implantable manufacturer where it's domestic Europe. Can you just get some eyes and ears into that facility? Yes or no? That will probably happen, where I think it's back to Ravi's model, where I think you mentioned about it depends upon which type of product, it depends upon what type of or level of automation and integration you've got, and let the notified bodies make decisions from that then as to justify why or why not they are on site.
Yeah, very good. Very insightful. So maybe a question for you from the audience here, Cisco. Is there a sense that the Case for Quality initiative should start to look at a playbook potentially for what's no longer necessary to be on site? So in other words, a library of successful practices or lessons learned around what doesn't necessarily need to be on site. What's your view on that?
I actually think that's a really good opportunity to bring the collective experience. I think that's in the collaborative community. There is a lot that we've learned right now that really does take a rethinking as we move forward, right? We're not necessarily 100% sure what the pace is. You've heard it already a couple of times of resuming normal operations, even our inspections, right? Right now, for foreseeable future, they're going to be based on risk, as was denoted beforehand, for being on site, and we have still practiced that quite a bit. There's also going to be the idea of, as we come out of it, the prioritization is probably going to be on making sure that things that went on through these emergency use authorizations is all really where it needs to be. So that's really going to be the focus for a while. But that doesn't mean that we haven't learned that there is some benefit, to this process, to this mechanism. There is a way to make it work, but it does mean rethinking some of our initial assumptions that went into why we do audits, why we do inspections, and bringing that community together is probably the right mechanism to start having those discussions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we're good on questions now, so appreciate that. Appreciate the feedback and questions from the live audience. So if nothing further, I'm going to hand it back to you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem, and our panel for a very interesting and lively discussion and for your participation in the live Q&A. Remember to join us on April 28th, day 2 of our forum, when we will hear updates on Safe Space, MDIAS, and our panel on Leadership Engagement Playbook and Culture of Quality. Thank you.